Disney is supposed to be the happiest place on earth, a kingdom built on childhood nostalgia, on magic, innocence, and the dream of perfect family vacations. A world where grown-ups can be kids again, where you're safe to laugh, play, and believe, even if it's just for one day, where nothing bad ever happens, where reality stays at the gate. But what if that carefully curated illusion was hiding something much darker? Behind the smiles, the catchy songs, the fireworks, and the castles, are there stories Disney doesn't want you to hear? Because if the illusion breaks, if people stop believing it's safe for them and their children, what happens to the billion-dollar machine? Welcome to Deep, Dark, and Scary. My name is Jenny, and every week we bring you chilling true crime cases, mysterious disappearances, survival stories, and the dark truths the world would rather forget. If you'd like to hear more, hit the subscribe button, tap the like button, and don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss an upload. This podcast is for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Today, we're looking at one of the darkest tragedies ever to unfold on Disney property. Not inside the parks, but just minutes away in a town Disney designed and built, Celebration, Florida. With its pastel homes, wide picket fences, and manicured lawns, Celebration was supposed to be the picture-perfect community, an embodiment of the American dream. But in early January 2020, that illusion shattered. Inside one of those cheerful homes, an entire family had quietly vanished over the holidays. The Todts, Tony, Megan, and their 3 children. No lights, mail piling up, and then the smell. Something horrific was rotting behind closed doors. When federal agents arrived to arrest Tony Todt for insurance fraud, they expected paperwork. But when agents finally entered, what they found instead was a nightmare even Disney couldn't script. Megan Todt, their children Alec, Tyler, and Zoe, and even the family dog Breezy, all found dead in their beds. And Anthony Todt, drugged, rambling, barely conscious, lying besides them, alive and confessing. How did no one notice what was happening inside that house? And how did a town built by Disney become the setting of one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in modern American history? This is the story of the Todt family murders and the crumbling illusion of safety, family, and innocence in the happiest place on earth. Celebration was everything Walt Disney imagined Main Street USA could be, but real. Because Walt didn't just dream about castles and rides, he wanted to build a better world. By the 1960s, Walt Disney was already dreaming beyond the castle and theme park gates. He envisioned a utopia, clean, safe, dreamy, and orderly, a town powered by innovation, design, and traditional values. He called it Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Not a fantasy land, but a real residential city where people could live, work, and raise families in a perfectly controlled environment. But in December 1966, before his vision could become reality, Walt Disney died of lung cancer. He was 65 and a lifelong heavy smoker. After Walt's passing, his brother Roy O. Disney stepped up to ensure his brother's dream of a large-scale theme park and resort would be realized. What became Walt Disney World, which opened in 1971. Roy died just a few months later, and with both visionaries gone, the company's creative soul and the dream of a futuristic city faded. Still, the idea lingered. Decades later, and in the 1990s, Disney executives resurrected a piece of Walt's original vision, but in a new form. In its planning stages, Celebration was supposed to be a part of Walt Disney World's master plan, but was eventually developed as a separate town. They called it Celebration, Florida. Built in 1994 on 5,000 acres of Disney-owned land, just minutes from Magic Kingdom. It was the company's attempt to design not just theme parks, but lives. Every detail was designed for charm and control. Houses came in nostalgic architectural styles, colonial Victorian craftsmen, but all new, all pristine. Wide front porches, perfectly manicured lush lawns. Even the birds chirped on schedule, thanks to hidden speakers in the trees. In autumn, truckloads of dried leaves were scattered across the sidewalks to mimic seasonal change. In winter, artificial snow was blown over Market Street during nightly festivities, and there was also an ice rink in town square. The streets were walkable. There was also a school, a hospital, a post office, a town hall. It was as if you'd stepped onto the set of The Truman Show, and that was the point. Only this wasn't fiction. Celebration was designed to feel like 1950s America, without the mess of modern life. No car accidents, no grime, crime, or unpredictability. Just charm, order, smiling families, happiness. And that was the problem, because when you build a town like a movie set, you only show what's meant to be seen. And when something doesn't fit the script, it gets hidden. Which brings us to 2019. In a beautiful white house in Celebration, just blocks away from town square, the Todt family seemed to be living the dream. Tony, Megan, and their 3 children, a Disney-perfect family in a Disney-made town. The truth about the Todt family finally surfaced in January 2020. But the story behind what happened in that Florida home doesn't start in Celebration, and it doesn't start in 2020. To understand the horror that unfolded behind those closed doors, you have to go back long before the pastel houses and white fences, before Disney ever dreamed of building a town, because the roots of this tragedy may lie with another man. And what he did decades earlier will cast a shadow so deep, some believe it never stopped following his son. Before Anthony Todt became known for one of the most chilling family murder cases in modern American history, there was his father, Robert Todt, and some believe that's where the darkness began. It was July 1980. Anthony was just 4 years old when something unimaginable happened in the family's suburban home in Ben Salem, Pennsylvania. His mother, Loretta Todt, was shot in the face, execution style, while lying in bed. Miraculously, she survived, blinded in one eye, partially paralyzed, and left permanently scarred, but alive. At first, the attack looked like a random break-in, but the truth unraveled fast and it led straight to Anthony's father. Robert Todt wasn't some career criminal in the shadows. He was a well-known special educations teacher and wrestling coach, respected, charismatic, and trusted. But behind closed doors, he was living a double life. At the time of the attempted murder, Robert was having an affair with one of his students, a 17-year-old girl. This wasn't just an affair with a mistress for Robert. Prosecutors said he was in love with the underage student and he wanted to start a new life with her. And his wife, Loretta, Tony's mother, was in the way. But instead of pulling the trigger himself, Robert paid someone to do it. A 19-year-old former student with developmental disabilities named John Chermont was supposed to carry out the hit. The bullet destroyed Loretta's left eye and remained lodged in her skull, but she miraculously survived. And a 4-year-old Tony? He was there that night and witnessed the assault, and the gunman shooting his mother Loretta in the head. An experience that left a deep mark on his early childhood, and a trauma that would never leave him. Robert Todt was eventually arrested, convicted of attempted murder, conspiracy, and criminal solicitation. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years for planning the execution of his wife, while his son slept in the very next room. But he served only 10 years before walking free. After surviving the awful attack orchestrated by her husband, Loretta at first defended Robert. She couldn't believe he would do such a thing. However, over time, reality set in, and she divorced him, remarried, and tried to rebuild her life and provide stability for her son, Anthony. But what does that kind of trauma do to a child? There's no simple answers, but what's certain is that Anthony Todt grew up inside a story of betrayal. The mother who survived a brutal attack and a father who caused it. What happened to Anthony as a child must have left a scar. But for years, Anthony seemed to grow up into a man who had escaped that darkness. He became a physical therapist, a healer, a husband, and a father of 3. On the surface, he seemed like a man who had built a good life. But like the town he would one day call home, Celebration, Florida, Anthony Todt presented the world with a carefully constructed image, calm, wholesome, and harmless. The true weight of his father's legacy wouldn't reveal itself until January 2020, when Anthony Todt showed the world just how much he had inherited. Decades after one Todt tried to get rid of his wife, his son would go even further. murdering not just his wife, but his 3 children and even the family dog. Then living in the house for weeks with their bodies before finally being found. If you had asked anyone who knew Tony Todt growing up, they would have said he was perfect. In high school, Tony was the kind of student teachers admired and classmates looked up to. Smart, kind, endlessly helpful. He tutored struggling peers, kept a spotless record, and made time for everyone. He was on the honor roll, he played varsity soccer all 4 years, and he was elected class president not once, but twice. He wasn't just well-liked, he was beloved, the kind of kid you'd call the all-American boy. But what no one saw was what he was carrying inside. On the outside, Tony showed no signs of the darkness his father's actions left in his life, and he witnessed at just 4 years old. And when he met Megan, the woman who would one day become his wife, it looked like everything fell into place. Like Tony, Megan Todt was deeply loved by those who knew her. While Tony often stood in the spotlight as the charismatic overachiever, Megan was the grounding force. She was gentle, calm, emotionally intelligent, the kind of person people instinctively turned to when they needed comfort. Megan also had a quiet strength about her. She was musically gifted, nurturing, and deeply compassionate, the kind of mother and friend who made everyone feel safe. Where Tony could be boastful, Megan was humble. The two met in college, and their relationship quickly blossomed. To those around them, they seemed inseparable, a couple defined by loyalty and support. They seemingly communicated openly, shared big dreams, and cheered each other on. After graduating, they moved to Colchester, Connecticut, where they began building what looked like a picture-perfect life. Tony and Megan opened a clinic together, Family Physical Therapy. Both of them were licensed physical therapists and quickly became local fixtures. Patients loved them, and word of mouth spread fast. Tony had a reputation for listening and treating people like neighbors, not numbers. Before long, he became something of a local celebrity, greeted in restaurants, recognized on the streets, even offered free services from grateful clients. And the business thrived, enough to expand into a second location. Megan eventually became a certified yoga instructor, helping clients through holistic movement and gentle recovery. But after the birth of their children, Megan shifted roles. Megan stepped away from the business and became a stay-at-home mom, homeschooling their 3 children, Alexander, Alec, who was 13, Tyler, who was 11, and Zoe, who was 4. Her curriculum was rooted in curiosity, kindness, and creativity. Megan poured herself into her children in teaching them not just academics, but empathy and emotional expression. She was known to value education, creative and spiritual practices, and she herself was a creative and musical person. She encouraged her children to explore the arts. Alec learned piano and violin. Tyler picked up piano and folk guitar. Neighbors remember Alec and Tyler knocking on doors after snowstorms, asking if they could help shovel driveways. They would also carry groceries unprompted and were polite, well-spoken, good kids. Tony coached youth soccer in his spare time, and Megan always offered a listening ear. By all accounts, they were living the dream. A beautiful family, thriving careers, a reputation for generosity, warmth, and service. Because for Tony Todt, appearance was everything. But being perfect wasn't just a goal, it was a mask. Because just like the town of Celebration, Tony's entire life was a facade, and he wore his mask so well for so long that even he may have started to believe it himself. And in 2017, that mask began to crack. And once it did, everything else began to crumble. But even in the middle of this seemingly idyllic family life, something shifted. Allegedly, it began with Megan's health. According to Tony Todt, it all started with a trip to Disney World, a place the family loved and visited often. Tony claimed that during one of those vacations, Megan was bitten by a tick. That bite, he said, infected her with Lyme disease, the most common vector-borne illness in the United States, according to the CDC. Lyme disease is transmitted to humans through the bite of infected black-legged ticks and can cause flu-like symptoms, fever, fatigue, headaches, and a distinctive skin rash. But if left untreated, it can become chronic, impacting the joints, nervous system, and even the heart. Still, in most cases, it's treatable with a few weeks of antibiotics. But Tony insisted Megan's case was different, far more severe than what most people experienced. In statements later made to police and even in letters to his father, Tony described Megan's condition as devastating. He said she was in constant pain, bedridden, losing weight rapidly, unable to care for herself or the children, and emotionally spiraling. He portrayed himself as a full-time caregiver, doing everything he could to find a cure. He claimed they saw doctor after doctor, but no one could help. It was a story of suffering, of a family pushed to the edge by chronic illness. But there's the problem. There are no medical records confirming Megan ever had Lyme disease, no documentation, no confirmed diagnoses, no clinical evidence at all. Still, citing her declining health, Tony said the family made the drastic decision to leave everything behind in Connecticut and move to Florida, more specifically to Celebration, the Disney-designed town just minutes from the Magic Kingdom. Tony claimed the warm climate would help Megan's symptoms, that sunshine and mild winters would ease her pain, and Megan, according to her family, liked the idea of living close to the parks, not just for the magic, but for homeschooling field trips to enrich the children's learning. So, the Todts packed their lives into moving trucks and headed south for a fresh start. But in hindsight, the move wasn't just about the weather and healing the alleged disease. It was the beginning of a quiet unraveling. Once in Celebration, Florida. But even after relocating states away, Tony didn't stop working in Connecticut. Instead, he created a punishing routine. He worked in his 2 physical therapy clinics Tuesday through Friday, then flew to Florida on Friday nights. He'd spend the weekend with Megan and the kids, then fly back to Connecticut on Monday nights to start the cycle all over again. During the week, he had no permanent home. He bounced between hotels, family homes, or even slept on the floor in his office. It was odd. And it got even stranger when on top of the condo they bought in Celebration, the Todts also rented a second house nearby. No one quite understood why. But Tony and Megan were respected, and people didn't ask too many questions. Tony later claimed the move was good for the family. But others saw something different. Back in Colchester, Megan had been a pillar of the community. She was active, vibrant, always seen with her children or leading yoga classes. Neighbors described her as nurturing, calm, and always willing to lend a hand. But in Celebration, that energy faded. She became more withdrawn, harder to reach. Lyme disease allegedly contributed to her depression and increased social withdrawal. Neighbors rarely saw her outside. She didn't seem to socialize much, and when she did, it was brief. The same shift happened with the children. In Connecticut, Alec and Tyler had been known for helping neighbors, shoveling snow, offering to carry groceries, playing with other kids on the block. But in Celebration, they kept to themselves. People described them as polite but distant. No one really knew the family. What had once been a warm social household had gone quiet. Something changed, and it wasn't just Megan or the kids. By 2019, even Tony started to shift. In Connecticut, he had always been seen as tireless and generous. He was known for listening deeply to his patients, and even spent $100,000 on a specialized hydrotherapy treadmill just to expand his treatments. His schedule grew more chaotic, his energy seemed stretched thin, and back in Florida, things were getting even worse. Not just emotionally, but financially. Tony's financial fraud. By 2019, the cracks in Tony Todd's perfect image were no longer subtle. They were widening fast. Tony had gained a significant amount of weight, been diagnosed with diabetes, and by his own admission was overwhelmed, stressed, and exhausted. The once engaged, compassionate, and attentive therapist was now distracted, always on his phone, zoned out in appointments and detached from patients. Even loyal clients noticed. One called him out on it, and Tony only offered a weak excuse. He was just tired and overworked. And on the surface, that was believable. Between running 2 clinics, flying between states, supposedly caring for a chronically ill wife, raising 3 children, and living half the week without a home, stress made sense. But what didn't make sense was the fraud. Long before the murders, Tony Todt was unraveling, not just as a father and husband, but as a business owner, living far beyond his means. He had 2 physical clinics in Connecticut, and to the outside world, he appeared successful. He was flying back and forth from Florida every week, maintaining 2 homes near Disney World, taking frequent lavish vacations, and presenting the image of a thriving family man. But behind the scenes, his businesses were hemorrhaging money. The FBI steps in. In April 2019, the FBI began investigating Tony Todt for medical billing fraud. It started with one patient, someone who noticed they were being charged for care they never received, thousands of dollars in fake billing, and it wasn't an isolated case. Then others stepped forward. Dozens of patients, many of whom trusted Tony, were being billed for appointments they never even attended, sometimes for months at a time. Others noted inflated charges or duplicate billings. Eventually, one former patient contacted authorities, claiming their insurance had been charged for over $20,000 in treatments they never received. That single tip triggered a federal investigation, and what the FBI found was staggering. The FBI soon uncovered widespread fraud tied to Tony's clinics and a pattern of systematic overfilling, falsifying treatment sessions, and manipulation of insurance codes, and even billing for entire sessions when Tony wasn't physically present, including days he was out of state. The scale was staggering. The fraud totaled more than $130,000. Prosecutors believed the money was being funneled to maintain appearances, the homes, the travel, the frequent flights between states, a life he simply could not afford. In truth, Tony's clinics were bleeding money. He had taken out loans from New York investment firms, racking up hundreds of thousands in debts. His employees' paychecks were bouncing, and he blamed the bank. In December, the FBI arrived at Family Physical Therapy, Tony's office in Colchester, Connecticut, with a search warrant and confronted Tony. At first, he denied everything and claimed he was innocent, suggesting it must be a clerical error, a simple administrative mistake or miscommunication with his billing staff. But as agents laid out the evidence, months of paperwork, fake invoices, manipulated codes, billing logs, emails, and travel records, Tony changed his story and broke. He admitted it all. He confessed that he had been intentionally overbilling patients, stating that it had become easier to just pad the invoices than figure out how to fix the finances. He had defrauded insurers. He'd done it to stay afloat, to buy time, to keep the image alive. He also insisted no one else was involved, not his employees, and especially not Megan, who hadn't worked in the business since Zoe was born. Despite the confession, the FBI did not arrest him immediately because he had no known criminal history and he was cooperating. They allowed him to return home to Florida for the holidays on the condition that he would turn himself in after the new year. Tony told the FBI he'd spent the holidays with his family and taking the rest of December off. They didn't consider him a flight risk. He had a home, business, a wife, 3 children, and no prior record. So they agreed. But his employees saw something different. When Tony returned to the clinic that day, he was white as a sheet, visibly shaken and barely able to speak. He told his staff that the visit was nothing serious, but they didn't believe him. And they were right, because that day in December 2019 was the last time any of them would ever see Tony Todt. No one comes home for Christmas. For the first time since their move in 2017, the Todts didn't make the winter trip north. The Todt family's usual holiday traditions were suddenly and strangely disrupted. They had always traveled from Florida back to Connecticut to spend Christmas with family. But in 2019, they didn't come back and stayed in Florida. Just days later, communication with their extended family abruptly stopped. Tony claimed Megan was too sick to travel. Megan sent a message to relatives. The entire family had the flu. They were too sick to talk and wouldn't be taking any phone calls, only texts, even over the holidays, that they wanted to use the Florida parks for homeschooled field trips. Privately, some suspected Megan had a falling out with her mother and didn't want to return north. Then, just a week before Christmas, another message came, this time from Tony. He said the family was going off the grid and wouldn't be reachable, turning off their phones entirely. Megan, he claimed, had already lost hers. Only Tony's phone would remain active. To the family, it didn't make sense. None of it added up. Not even their own explanations were consistent. A concerned sister. No phone calls, no contact, no Christmas greetings. Something felt off, especially to Tony's sister, Chrissy. She'd been uneasy about Tony for some time. Now the silence felt deliberate. Concern turned to alarm, and behind the closed doors of their celebration home, something was about to happen that no one could have ever imagined. On December 29th, Chrissy called the Osceola County Sheriff's Office requesting a welfare check. She told them about the strange messages, the family flu, and the sudden radio silence. Deputies arrived at the house. Mail was piled up on the porch. The house looked dark and lifeless, but there were no signs of forced entry. They knocked, walked the perimeter, found nothing suspicious, and left. Chrissy called back, reminding them that Tony and Megan owned 2 properties in Celebration, a house and a condo. Deputies checked the condo too. Same result. Locked doors, no movement, no probable cause to enter. They told Chrissy the family was probably traveling, that nothing seemed wrong, that they'd be back soon, but Chrissy couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. Days later, Chrissy received a message, not from her brother, but from a stranger. They had found Tony's phone left behind in a Starbucks in Sarasota. They were trying to return it after seeing Chrissy's messages. At the same time, a neighbor called Chrissy to report something else. An eviction notice had been posted on the family's front door. Chrissy's anxiety spiked. She tried again to contact the Todts and was met with complete silence. Then came another call, this time from the FBI. The FBI had been trying to reach Tony. After his confession weeks earlier, he had promised to return after Christmas, meet with his lawyer, and face the consequences. But he never showed. They were concerned he had fled, possibly even left the country. His Connecticut clinic still had signs saying he'd reopen in the new year. His employees had no idea what was happening, and no one, not even his family or friends, knew how deeply he was in trouble. Once Chrissy learned about the investigation, everything clicked. The text, the secrecy, the silence. It was no longer a family avoiding holiday travel. It was something else entirely. Chrissy again called the police, told them about the FBI, about the strange behavior, about how no one had spoken to Tony or Megan, not even by phone, since December 28th. The sheriff's office conducted another welfare check. Same house, same condo, same result. Everything looked still, mail untouched, eviction notice still posted, no movement inside. They assured Chrissy the family was probably just on vacation. She called back every day, January 10th, 11th, and 12th, begging them to go back, telling them something was wrong. But with no sounds, no smells, no signs of violence, and no legal reason to enter, deputies walked away each time. Inside that house, just minutes from Disney World, the truth was waiting, and what they would find was worse than anything Chrissy could have imagined. Inside the house. On January 13th, 2020, 3 FBI agents from Connecticut arrived in Celebration, Florida to arrest Tony Todt. They spotted him that morning outside his house, shaky and disoriented, which confirmed his presence. Backup officers arrived, and with a key from the landlord, they entered the home, only to be hit immediately by the stench of decomposition. Inside, the house was dark and sealed. Tony emerged muttering from the staircase, claiming Megan was asleep upstairs and that the children were at a friend's. But when agents entered the master bedroom, they discovered the decomposing bodies of Megan Todt, sons Alec and Tyler, and the family dog Breezy. The 4-year-old Zoe's remains were so deteriorated that she was initially missed. Tony had lived in the home with their corpses for at least 2 weeks. He admitted taking Benadryl in a failed suicide attempt, saying he wanted to join his family in the afterlife. At the hospital, under police supervision, he confessed to murdering his family. At first, he claimed everything was part of a murder-suicide pact that Megan had agreed to, and they planned it together, that they believed in an impending apocalypse, and that they would cross over together as a family. He claimed he drugged the children with Benadryl, that his wife stabbed herself but didn't die, and asked him to suffocate her, and then attempted to overdose himself. He said he lived with the bodies for weeks, waiting to die. The most damning part of Tony's confession were the specific details he gave about how each person died. Todt admitted to suffocating his daughter Zoe, suffocating and stabbing his 2 sons, Alex and Tyler, and smothering Megan at her request after she attempted suicide but failed. Tony's shifting stories, confessions, contradictions, and collapse. Following the discovery of the bodies, Anthony Todt was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. But soon after, the narrative began to unravel. In later interviews, Tony claimed he didn't remember anything, and that Megan may have killed the children, and that he returned home to find them already dead. Tony offered conflicting, elaborate versions of events, including one where he left the house to retrieve a necklace from their condo and returned to find the family dead. This story was contradicted by the condo showing no signs of forced entry, and the necklace later being found where he claimed to have searched. In a call to his sister Chrissy, he again referenced the necklace and repeated the timeline, but the details remain contradictory. His shifting stories, blaming Megan, claiming he had amnesia, and introducing implausible elements like poisoned pie, cast serious doubts on his credibility. Despite multiple versions of events, Tony remained the only suspect in the murders. The physical evidence and his early confession made the prosecution believe that he acted alone, and that the supposed pact was a fabrication, a way to deflect blame, to paint himself as a man who lost everything, rather than a man who destroyed everything. For the FBI agents who had sat across him just days before, it was clear. The financial pressure, the looming federal charges, and the collapse of his carefully constructed image had all contributed to an unthinkable breaking point. Details of Tony's letter to his father. After being released from Suicide Watch in early 2020, Tony Todt wrote a lengthy and contradictory letter to his father, Robert Todt, attempting to explain what happened and, more significantly, trying to further reshape the narrative, deflect responsibility around the brutal murder of his family and their dog. The letter was screened by authorities and later leaked in full to the press. In this version of events, he insists he's 10,000% innocent. Tony once again blamed Megan, claiming he wasn't home when the murders happened, and saying she murdered the children, and then tried to take her own life. He said he came home to find the family dead, and Megan asking him to help her die, by smothering her with a pillow, which he says he failed to do. This narrative directly contradicts earlier statements where Tony confessed to killing the family himself. He stated that he had forgiven her and attributes her actions to suffering, a spiritual delusion, years of chronic illness and mental health issues, and spiritual beliefs about an impending apocalypse. He also repeatedly insists that he's a loving father and husband who was doing everything he could to support his sick wife and raise their children, despite having confessed to the murders shortly after his arrest. Tony framed his intense work schedule and role as a caretaker as martyr-like, claiming he made meals, drove kids to school, and performed physical therapy on his wife multiple times a day. His own letters also contradicts his own timeline, placing Megan's tick bite not in 2017 as he initially claimed, but in 2011 or 12. He also falsely claimed that Megan handled all the family's finances, though public records and employee testimonies showed he was the sole controller. His claim that Megan was responsible for fraudulent billing, despite having left the business years earlier, is widely discredited. All these claims contrast with evidence of his increasing detachment and deteriorating behavior in the years before the murders. Throughout the letter, Tony maintains his innocence, not just regarding the murders, but also the medical fraud investigation that was active at the time of the killings. In the letter, Tony also referenced a large life insurance policy on himself, but only $200,000 on Megan, implying it could help him rebuild after prison. He downplays the FBI confession, suggesting it was made under duress after a suicide attempt involving Benadryl. But again, this contradicts previous claims that he had no memory of the events. He even describes in detail being arrested and falling down exactly 10 stairs, despite saying he had no recollection from the arrest until days later. Tony also accuses the media and the sheriff department of portraying him unfairly, claiming he's not jail material and that he's mentally sound, healthy, and rediscovering his former self. Throughout the letter, he tries to maintain the image of a devoted, noble family man, despite having found living in the home for weeks with the decomposing bodies of his wife, children, and family dog. Critics of the letter point out that Anthony's tone is manipulative, filled with self-pity, virtue signaling, and riddled with contradictions. While he asked his father to keep the letter confidential, it's likely he knew it would eventually become public and used it to try to control the narrative. Ultimately, every major point in Tony's narrative is undermined by forensic evidence, timelines, public records, and his own shifting versions of events. His efforts to preserve his image, even while confessing, are consistent with someone desperate to control perception rather than reveal truth. The trial. Anthony Todt's trial began in April 2022, over 2 years after authorities discovered him living with the decomposing bodies of his wife Megan, their 3 children, and the family dog in their home in Celebration, Florida. By the time the trial began, his story had shifted. He claimed his confession was made under duress and that he had no memory of the killings. But investigators testified that he was coherent, detailed, and consistent in the hours after his arrest when initially confessing. From the start, the prosecution laid out a case of calculated, premeditated murder, pointing to Todd's multiple confessions, the toxicology reports, and the circumstances of the FBI's arrival at the home. According to his original statements to police, Tony admitted that he and Megan had planned the murders, that she suffered from the Lyme disease, depression, and miscarriages, and began practicing a Hinduism-based religion with an afterlife component. Taking the stand in his own defense, Tony claimed now that Megan had murdered the children while he was away. He testified that he returned home sometimes between December 14th to 18th, 2019, to find them dead, and Megan confessing to him before stabbing herself and showing him a suicide note. He claimed, "She said the kids were dead, and Zoe is my little angel. That's the first one I went to." He described finding all 3 children dead, then seeing Megan stab herself on the bed. Tony said he yelled out of the window for help, but didn't want to leave Megan alone to find help. Instead, he began looking for cell phones that Megan allegedly hid from him. "If I left her, I thought she was going to die. I thought in my decision-making, the best chance was for her to tell me where the phones were." He also said that Megan allegedly wanted to be with her kids before she died. "I couldn't help my wife pass. I felt like a failure. I wasn't there the night my kids died. I decided I wanted to be with my family, that I wanted to die, that I deserved to die. She had blood on her shirt, and after that, I said a few uncolored words to her. I went and discovered the kids. I went into the other room and found them dead." When asked about the contradictions between his confession and his story now, Anthony claimed he lied to police because he wanted to cover for his wife and protect her legacy and shield the family from shame. The prosecution dismantled his version, piece by piece, and the physical evidence remained consistent, besides his changing stories. There were no signs of forced entry. The high Benadryl levels in Megan, Alec, and Tyler confirmed they had been sedated. Autopsy revealed that Megan, Alec, and Tyler had all been stabbed in the abdomen. Zoe, the youngest, had been suffocated. Tony's DNA and fingerprints were found throughout the scene. Alec had the least Benadryl in his system and had visible defensive wounds, suggesting he tried to fight back. Megan, on the other hand, had no injuries, indicating she didn't attack anyone, and no proof existed that she had taken her own life. Prosecutors emphasized that the staging of the bodies with rosaries placed in their hands showed a disturbing level of deliberation. The prosecution argued that Todd's motive was financial collapse. He was under active FBI investigation for defrauding Medicaid and private insurance companies, and deep in debt. His businesses were failing, and his employees' paychecks started to bounce. After short deliberation, the jury found Tony Todt guilty on all counts, 4 murders and 1 count of animal cruelty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite the conviction, Tony continues to maintain his innocence and has filed an appeal, still insisting that Megan was responsible. Breezy. In addition to being convicted for murdering his wife and 3 children, Tony Todt was also found guilty of killing the family dog, Breezy, who was discovered dead in his dog bed, along with the rest of the family, in the master bedroom. For that, the court added 1 more year to his already lifelong sentence. It was seemingly a small addition in terms of time, but a deeply symbolic one, underscoring the totality of what he had done. During sentencing, the judge looked directly at Tony and called him a destroyer of worlds, borrowing the phrase made famous by Oppenheimer. It was a stark condemnation of a man who had not only ended lives, but obliterated the very center of his family's universe, leaving behind nothing but grief, confusion, and the eerie silence of a home that once held so much promise. The aftermath of the trial left a lasting scar on the Todt and Coleman families. Megan's relatives firmly rejected Tony's version of events, insisting she would never harm her children and was not suffering from the delusions Tony described. They mourned not only the loss of Megan and the kids, but the deep betrayal of a man they had once trusted. To this day, no singular confirmed motive has ever been established for the murders. Prosecutors argued that financial collapse and the looming FBI indictment were likely triggers. Tony was drowning in debt, living beyond his means, and facing serious prison time. But what makes the Todt case so chilling is that no clear explanation has ever truly surfaced. Todt himself gave multiple contradictory accounts, none of which ever could be fully corroborated. Whether it was the pressure, shame, or a delusional belief that death was a way to protect his family, we simply don't know. The motive remains speculative. What we do know is that the crime was deliberate, methodical, and devastating. Let's talk a bit about the psychology behind family annihilations, which is one of the most disturbing forms of homicide. It's when one parent, most often a father, murders their entire immediate family. These kinds of crimes are very rare, profoundly disturbing, and often defy simple explanation. Psychologists who study this form of mass murder have identified a few recurring profiles in these cases and typically place perpetrators into 4 rough categories. The self-righteous killers, who blame their spouse for the breakdown of the family and often seek to punish them. The anomic killers, whose identity is tied to economic success and views their family as a reflection and extension of their financial success and status or failure. And when their perceived role as provider collapses, they believe the family must end with them. The disappointed killers, feels and believes their family has failed to meet and live up to their expectations, morally, socially, and otherwise. Paranoid killers claim to be protecting and saving their loved ones from real or imagined external threats and a worse fate. Most often these crimes are premeditated. They rarely involve heat-of-the-moment violence. The killer typically believes that ending their family's lives is somehow merciful or necessary, and then very often they plan to end their own life as well. These perpetrators often present as outwardly successful, even loving, but beneath the surface are feelings of control, narcissism, and deep-seated resentment. They see no path forward that allows them to maintain both their ego and their image, so they eliminate what they perceive as the source of their unraveling. Tony Todt's psychological state. In the case of Tony Todt, elements of several psychological profiles seem to collide. To outsiders, Tony was a doting father, a successful physical therapist, a man who commuted weekly between states just to provide for his family. But underneath the polished exterior was a man under immense financial and legal pressure. In the case of Anthony Todt, signs of extreme psychological deterioration were evident. By the time of the murders in December 2019, Tony was under enormous pressure. Tony claimed to have attempted suicide several times and said he was mentally broken. But he also oscillated between denial, delusion, and blame. Tony's psychological descent appears tied to a need to preserve control, not just of the family, but of the narrative. In interviews and letters, he would shift blame to his wife, claim memory loss, or contradict his own confessions. He described himself as a loving husband who cared for 6 spouse, a self-sacrificing father, doing everything for his kids. But the evidence told another story: defensive wounds on the eldest son, staged scenes in the bedroom, and a suicide attempt that was ultimately non-lethal. When faced with the collapse of his life, his finances, his freedom, his reputation, Tony didn't just destroy himself. He obliterated the entire family, as if removing them would erase the shame. In court he remained inconsistent, evasive, and strangely detached. It was a chilling portrait, not just of a killer, but of a man so consumed with preserving a fantasy that he chose annihilation over accountability. Psychologists and court observers noted that Todt appeared detached, performative, and still desperate to control the narrative, even writing long manipulative letters from jail defending his character and blaming others. Despite claiming to be a loving husband and father, his actions and the prolonged state in which he lived with the family's decomposing bodies pointed to a man who had utterly unraveled. And this brings us to the end of the case, one of the most haunting and perplexing family murders in recent memory that leaves me with a need for more answers in regards to Tony's motive. Why did he really do this to his family, and even the family dog? Such a coward and these poor innocent people. Was this just an act of a desperate man backed in a corner, or a calculated attempt to control his family, or the final narrative? Was it about insurance money, ego, illness, or all of it at once? Did he initially believe he would get away with this through his ridiculous explanations and stories? Do you believe any of Tony Todt's ever-changing confessions, or do you think the full truth hasn't even come out yet? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What's certain is this: in a quiet town designed to feel like a dream, the Todt family's story became a nightmare, one that will never be forgotten. If you learned something new or this case stayed with you, please give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Deep, Dark, and Scary for more unsettling stories. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves, because it's a deep, dark, and scary world out there. And I'll see you next time. Bye.